Welcome to Voices of WIA. This is the show by Women in Apologetics, which seeks to equip you to defend your faith with confidence. My name is Laura Powell, and I'm your host today. Our topic this month is one that I know many of you have been looking forward to. If you followed us on social media, you've noticed our theme throughout March has been getting back to the basics of apologetics. Well, tonight our discussion will delve deeper into this topic and explore not only the basics of apologetics, but how we can apply it to our everyday lives. Before we get into this exciting conversation with Amy Hall, we want to tell you about our upcoming 2022 annual conference. Amy is going to be one of our speakers, along with many other excellent Christian apologists. This conference will take place on June 9th through 11th in Boca Raton, Florida, and this is sure to be the best conference yet, with more than 20 speakers and sessions covering plenty of practical apologetic topics, plus many opportunities for fellowship with like-minded women. If you haven't purchased your ticket yet, you can do so at the link below. We can't wait to learn and grow together during this amazing event. I'd like to introduce you to tonight's guest for this discussion. Amy Hall has an MA in Christian Apologetics from Biola University and currently works as a writer, editor, and podcaster for Stand to Reason, where she explores culture, ethics, philosophy, and theology in light of the truth of the Christian worldview. Her goal is to help Christians truly grasp the fact that Christianity equals reality, giving people the confidence and ability to apply and live out this truth in every area of their lives so that they may know, love, and serve Christ as whole people in the fullest way possible. You can hear her on Stand to Reason's podcast, hashtag STRask. I'm a huge fan of that podcast, a huge fan of Amy, and I'm really excited to welcome my friend and a fellow apologist, Amy Hall. Amy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for that great introduction, Laura. It's always good to see you, and I always love talking about these things, so I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's go ahead and dive right in. Despite the prevalence of apologetics all throughout the Bible, a lot of Christians seem to dismiss the need for apologetics. At Women in Apologetics, we often hear things like, well, there's no need to study anything except the Bible. And it's dangerous to learn about other worldviews and religions. And apologetics is too focused on head knowledge, or it's too complicated to understand. Others have told me that they don't want to learn apologetics because they don't want to get into arguments. How do you respond to these types of concerns?
Okay, you said a few things there. It's too much head knowledge. It's dangerous. There's not a need for it. What was that last one you said?
I don't want to get into arguments.
Arguments. Okay, so I'll take each one of those one at a time. And the first one, in terms of being worried that it's too much head knowledge, this is really common. I actually hear this a lot, but I think that objection comes down to a misunderstanding of what our personalities are and what our gifts are. And here's what I mean. For a long time, the only people who were involved in apologetics were people who were very left-brained, if I can remember which is which. The left brain, the logical side.
I believe that's left brain, yeah.
Yes. So what happened is that it took on that kind of personality for a very long time. But what will not happen if you start using apologetics won't turn you into a left-brain person. All it will do is will allow God to use you in your personality and in your style, and you will be able to reach people in your own way. So don't be worried that it's going to change you into other people. God uses all kinds of people in all kinds of different ways. And so don't be afraid of that. Now, head knowledge. Okay, what do you think the Bible is? The Bible is head knowledge. The entire Bible is information about who God is and what he's done so that we can know him. And that is why we need head knowledge. You can't love someone you don't know. Mm-hmm. You have to know God in order to love him. And so as you're learning apologetics, you are learning about God, you're learning about how to respond to objections to Christianity. And all of that is needed for you to love God fully in all the different aspects of who he is. So that is a response to the head knowledge question. Now, is it dangerous to learn about other ideas? Well, the first thing I would say about this is you kind of have to know yourself. There could be something that you're actually tempted to. So let's say your past is you were into the occult or something like that. And maybe you don't want to keep up on what's going on in the occult world because of that. That's completely understandable. You do not have to study every single thing. You can be aware of what your temptations are and what your difficulties are. But I want to give you a different way of looking at this, because I have found that, and I'll just take Mormonism as an example because that's one of my favorite topics. But what I found is that when I am studying Mormonism, this actually causes me to worship God, because it shows the stark contrast between the true God and the true gospel, and then what these Mormons are believing in and trusting in. So as I contrast the truth with the false ideas, it actually causes me to worship and to love God more and to appreciate him more. Sometimes we don't realize what other people are experiencing.
Mhm.
So we are used to grace. We're used to certain things about God. We don't think about what it would be like if we had to earn our way in whatever religious system we're talking about. So
Right.
as you learn that, you are actually realizing it's helping you to see Christianity in a new way, and in a way that can be very powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I've actually spent a lot of time studying Islam and a lot of
Mhm.
years ministering to Muslims. And every time I sit down and study the Quran, study the Hadith, study the life of Muhammad, study what's expected of Muslims, talk to them about their where their hope is and things like this, the inevitable result is worship of the one true
Mhm.
God and gratefulness, prayer for my brothers and sisters, but absolute worship, even in tears, of God's grace, because they don't know God's grace. And yeah, that's an excellent, excellent point.
I learned that a long time ago when I was first a Christian and I was in college, and I had been around Christians for so long that I didn't realize what other people were going through. And then when I was living in the dorm for a while, and I actually got to know people and I saw things from their perspective, it
Mhm.
just made the whole thing seem like so much more amazing. It's just, I think it's very helpful. So then the next thing you said was, I don't see a need for apologetics. Well, apologetics is a way to serve others. Everything that God gives us, all the gifts that he gives, the knowledge that he gives, this is a way to serve others. And when you learn apologetics, it enables you to do is to talk to people in a way that they can understand. So you know a little bit about where they're coming from. You can ask them questions. You can find out what their issues are. You know what the answers are. And it enables you to respond to their objections. Now, another thing it does is that it increases your confidence. And this is kind of what we talked about. It increases your confidence as you test other worldviews and you see that Christianity holds up and these others don't. So it also increases your confidence. And it can help you to discern between true and false ideas. Because one thing we don't realize is that as we are in our culture, there are a lot of ideas that are coming at us all the time that are not biblical, but we're so used to hearing them that we don't realize it. But as you learn apologetics and you start to identify these false ideas, now you're picking them out in the culture. Now they're not kind of swaying you in certain ways, because you're aware of what they are and you're ready for them and you can identify them. So in all those ways, it helps you, it helps them. And ultimately, apologetics is about knowing God yourself and about demonstrating the reality of God to others. So all of these things, it's if this is something that you have an interest in, then by all means, learn what you can so that you can serve others with your knowledge.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about apologetics as a way to love and serve others. I have thought of it that way in terms of it's loving to tell people the truth. It's loving to offer them the truth of the hope of salvation. But as you were talking, I was thinking about how even it's because of apologetics that I've become interested in science, and that I've learned things about Hubble and his discoveries of the red shift. I've learned about Einstein and the theory of general relativity and things like this. And I didn't really care too much about those things in high school. I don't even know if we studied them. We may have. But I have a neighbor who loves science, and there are not a lot of people out there who love science. And because he loves science, and I have been studying a lot of the things that he's really excited and passionate about, I'm one of his favorite people to talk to when we're out walking our dogs. And he just gets so excited when he sees me, and he's like, "Hey, Laura, have you seen the James Webb telescope that's gone up?" And yeah, and he just loves to talk to me, and it's led to so many great spiritual conversations as well. I can ask him, "So interesting. So you agree on all this evidence for the beginning of the universe?" And he's like, "Yeah, of course, everybody believes in the Big Bang." And so ask him, so what, so what do you attribute as the cause of all that began? And we've just gotten into a lot of really great conversations, and he just gets so excited.
That brings up another thought for me. Some people can get overwhelmed by all the different topics that are out there, but if you learn them as you have need. So let's say you had met your neighbor and he brings one of those things up, and now you're like, okay, this is something I'm really interested in learning about because it's in service to this other thing.
Right.
A lot of times that's the motivating factor. So just go with what you need at the time. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to study every single topic. So that's another great point, Laura.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's excellent. Another thing objection I had mentioned was there's no need to study anything but the Bible. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But what I find is that studying the Bible leads me right back to apologetics, because that's what we see Jesus and Paul and Peter and others using, even beginning in the Old Testament, the use of evidence to show who the true God is. Is that what you find as well?
Yeah. So there are all sorts of gifts in this world, right? There's serving gifts. There are different gifts. Now, let's say your gift is hospitality. Now, would you say I have no need to look into hospitality to get better at that? I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah,
the Bible doesn't.
I've tried to get away with that one, because hospitality is not my gift. And people, my friends used to joke with me, "Oh yeah, not your gift. So you don't have to give anybody water if they're about to die." So
So we can learn about how to use our gifts from other people who've been there before, who have studied it. And so I don't see any problem with that. And I forgot, you also said something about people not wanting to be in arguments, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully, and I think we'll be talking about this a little more, when you described a conversation with your neighbor, and that didn't feel like an argument, right? It
Right.
was a conversation. You were
Exactly.
bringing up different ideas, and there are ways to do that. So it's not like what you see on Twitter
Right.
or what you might see in a formal debate. It's actually simply talking to people, asking them questions, finding out what they believe, responding to their objections. It doesn't have to be World War III.
Right.
There are ways to just have a regular conversation with people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, I find it helpful to equip me to engage in those conversations in a useful and fun manner, without getting all heated and passionate, because
Yes.
it's no longer a power play. You need to believe what I believe, or I need to force you to believe what you believe, when we're just putting forth evidence and saying, so what do you do with this evidence? This is what I've been discovering in my reading, and this is what I've been learning about. What do you do with that? So
Laura, you keep bringing up good points, because you reminded me of another thing. One thing that really helps me to stay, to not get really worked up, is to remember that my job is to bring about clarity. It's God's job to change people's hearts. I can't do that. And so my goal should not be to force people to do that. My goal is simply, I want to explain this as clearly as possible. And some people will not be convinced. And then God may open somebody's eyes to hear what I'm saying, and it will strike a chord with them. But if I just focus on my goal of clarifying the ideas and the reasons to believe those ideas, it brings everything down many notches because you're no longer feeling like you have to force them to agree with you.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I was reading John 6 this past week and saw a bunch of people walk away from Jesus and how he handled that, and that, it's okay. People are going to walk away. It's part of, it's part of it. It's not our job, like you said. I love that. It's not our job to change people's hearts. We're not the Holy Spirit. It's our job to faithfully present the truth.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love that. So along those lines, why don't we talk briefly about how to approach conversations like this. You recently on the STR Ask podcast, you had a question about the first Columbo question. I love the Columbo questions. Why don't you tell us what those are and maybe give us an idea of how you might use them in a real life situation?
Okay, great. So the Columbo questions are part of what's called tactics, and these were developed by my boss, Greg Kokel, at Stand to Reason. And the purpose of the tactics is, and people will hear tactics and they think, oh, now it's just impersonal and you're just saying the same thing over and over. That's not what it is at all. The purpose of the tactics are to help you to get to know the person, and so that you can give a personal response. It's to help you to have a personal conversation, as we said, without everything blowing up and people getting upset. And it's just a way of keeping the conversation focused and productive. And it's a way of keeping people engaged. And even if you don't know the answers, and this is the best part, especially if, you said you're getting back to the basics with this series of podcasts. So if you do not know a whole lot of answers yet, the tactics will even help you to have conversations in those situations.
Mm-hmm.
So the Columbo questions, and it's named after a detective on an old, I don't know if it was 70s or 80s, probably late 70s, early 80s.
I think it was 70s at the latest, I'm thinking, but yes.
I don't know.
Anyway.
Anyway, so he was a detective and he just asked a lot of questions, and Greg does a whole, imitation. I'm not going to try to do that.
Yes. If watchers have not seen Greg Kokel imitate Mr. Columbo, you have to see that. But anyway, yes.
So basically, there are all sorts of different tactics to help you. It's basically to help you learn how to do critical thinking and to direct conversations. But there are three main questions, and they're very simple to learn, and they're very simple to use. And the first one's maybe more simple than the third one. But let's start with the first one. And the first question is, what do you mean by that? So somebody makes a claim, and then your response is, what do you mean by that? And all you're doing at this point is you're gathering information. You're trying to find out exactly what they are claiming, exactly what they are, their objection or their ideas or whatever it is. So you start with that one. What do you mean by that? The second question, once you know what they mean, is how did you come to that conclusion? Because when somebody makes a claim, whoever makes the claim, it's on them to give the reasons. So a lot of times what we do is somebody makes a claim and then we just respond and we try and say why they're wrong. Well, let them make their case first. Let's find out what their reasons are. Let's find out what they're thinking, why they're saying this. So they make a claim, you understand what it is, and then you ask, how did you come to that conclusion? Now, once you know what their reasons are, now you look at their reasons and you say, okay, is this logical? Did they miss a step here in their reasoning? Is there some flaw in their reasoning here? And that's when you ask, and it doesn't have to be these exact words, any of these, but something to the effect of, well, have you considered, or what do you think about this? And then you can point out something that went wrong with their reasoning. So let me give an example of how this could work. And I'll use something that's pretty classic. So say someone comes up to you and says, you've already told them about Christianity, and they say, well, that's great. That's true for you, but it's not true for me.
Yep. I've heard that plenty.
So,
yes.
So here's what we ask. What do you mean by that? What do you mean it's true for you, but not true for me? Well, they might say something like, well, everybody's belief is valid. Everybody has their own beliefs and they're all valid. Okay, so now you know what they mean by it's true for you, but not for me. So now we ask, why, how did you come to that conclusion? Or why do you think that? Or why is that your belief? Now, they could go a couple different ways here. They might say that it can be true for you, but not for me, because all religion is just a way for people to feel good about themselves, and none of them are actually true. Like, none of them reflect actual reality. They're all just things that we use to make ourselves feel good and to get through life. Okay.
Right.
Or what they might mean is that God is not narrow. So God has all these different ways, and you can use any of these ways to get to God, and he doesn't care. Now, those are two very different answers that will lead you to a different response, right? So you can see how our questions have drawn out the person we're talking to so that we can respond in a way. Because what if I had responded to that's true for you, but not for me, and I just started talking about no, Christianity is true, but they're still thinking no religion is true, or God doesn't care which religion is true. So I'm not actually addressing their question. So now that we know these things, it could be, it's either a way to feel good or it's God doesn't care. Well, now we can ask, well, what do you think about the idea that all truth is narrow? That there is that anytime you say something true, that 2 + 2 = 4 is actually narrow because it's describing reality. Or you could ask, what do you think about the ideas that there is actually a spiritual reality like there is a physical reality? So that, you know, we can describe it in the same way we describe anything in the world, and we can be right or wrong.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yep.
so now now they're thinking about this, and what you're doing with the questions is that you are enabling them to think through their claims in a way that will help them just be more clear about everything and to hear your message. So the tactics are fantastic. I highly recommend Greg's book. He wrote a whole book on a whole book on this, and he's actually working on a second one. So that one will hopefully be out later in the year. And I just think it's very helpful for people, especially if you don't have a whole lot of knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. I love these questions. I'm a huge fan of the tactics book. It's helped immensely, like you said, to really target in on what a person's objection is. It's actually, I'll just share really quickly before we go ahead and do the giveaway of the tactics book, which I'm excited about. But one of the times that's coming to mind when I asked, what do you mean by that? And it just made a world of difference was a Christian brother of mine told me that a common friend of ours had become a Christian. And this guy had been a hard atheist for years and years and years. And I had just had a conversation with him like earlier that day when I found out he's become a Christian. He didn't say anything to me about becoming a Christian. So I thought this was a little strange. I said, and this Christian brother said, yeah, he believes in Jesus now. He believes in Jesus. So I called our atheist friend and said, how you doing? Had a good talk or whatever. And I said in the course of the conversation, so I hear that you believe in Jesus now. Is that true? And he said, oh yeah, that is true. And I said, well, yeah, so what do you mean by that when you say, you believe in Jesus? And he said, well, I used to believe that Jesus never existed. But now, after reading some history books, I believe that Jesus was a man. He was just a man, of course, but he was a man who actually lived about 2,000 years ago. So yeah, I've changed my perspective on that. So that's a whole different thing than get out the champagne or the grape juice or whatever and start
Yes.
celebrating and bring him into the church. So I love, the nature of the question for really targeting what are we talking about? What do you mean by that? And so on. So speaking of tactics and the importance of these questions, we're going to do a giveaway. I'm very excited about this. This is one of the 3 books I tell everyone they absolutely must read if they're a Christian. And it has, as you said, the Columbo questions, what do you mean by that? How did you arrive at that conclusion? There are also lots of really great discussions about, how do we identify self-refuting statements? When do we use facts? How do we clarify what the facts are? What do we do in a situation when, someone is kind of steamrolling over us and that sort of thing? It's really practical. I have my copy right here. I love this book. I read it, kind of review it about once a year. And so we are going to go ahead and give away a copy right now. And this copy from Women in Apologetics is going to Jill Stevenson. Jill Stevenson is the winner. Congratulations. So I believe someone from WIA is going to contact you and ask for your address so they can send that over to you. And I hope you read that book, enjoy that book. Give copies to many of your friends, or let them borrow it if you find it worthwhile. So congratulations, Jill Stevenson. So let's go ahead and get back to the questions with Amy. I'd like to ask you, Amy, you're going to speak at our annual conference. I'm very excited to see you there. Very excited about your talk. And you're going to be talking about our behavior as an apologetic. So speaking of Columbo tactics, what do you mean by that? Can you give us a sneak peek of what we might expect?
Okay, sure. So the overall topic is how to persevere through opposition. And as part of that, what I'm trying to help people understand is how our behavior works as an apologetic. Now, I know behavior sounds like a boring topic, so don't tune out. What I really want to do is get you excited about it, because our improving our character and conforming our character to Christ is not mainly about being a better person, but about demonstrating and glorifying the beauties of Christ. So it's actually an apologetic for the gospel. Now, a few of the different books in the Bible talk about this, but I think probably the one that does the most is First Peter. So what Peter does in this book is he sets up the idea that our salvation is all by grace. And then he says in chapter 2, verse 9, but you are a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Now, in the context of what he's talking about here, he's talking about our behavior declaring the excellencies of God. Now, when you think about the excellencies of God, the highest excellencies of his character are demonstrated on the cross. On the cross, we see Jesus' self-sacrifice, his grace, his love. We see the power of God. But in terms of his character, we see a whole bunch of different things. He did not revile when reviled. When suffering, he uttered no threats. This is all in Peter. And the result, according to Peter, in one of the verses, is he says that so that people may be won to the gospel, so that people may glorify God when he comes. So as we respond to people the way that Christ did, and we don't return evil for evil. And again, if you go through First Peter and you look at all the times he describes Jesus's behavior and says that he is our example. He left an example for us, and God called us for this purpose, and we're suffering by the will of God, and we're supposed to reveal this to others. He says that over and over. So the result of us acting as Jesus is that people will see the gospel in our behavior. They will see Christ in our behavior. As sure as if you were to stand there and say, here's who Jesus is, and you describe how he is, if you're actually showing them how he is. Now, we all know that the verse about, the apologetics verse, be ready to give a defense, but do so with gentleness and reverence, right? Now, that verse comes in this context. And what Peter's talking about is he's talking about how we are when you suffer for the name of Christ and you respond as Christ did, he's encouraging you to do that despite the suffering that will cause. And what he says is, sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts. In other words, continue to do what's right no matter the suffering it causes you. And then he says, be ready to give a defense for the hope that's in you. Because your behavior, responding the way Jesus responded, will cause people to say, why are you doing things that are causing people to hate you? Why are you staying with God even though people are despising you? Why are you responding with grace? So he specifically says that our behavior there is what causes people to ask us to make a defense. So it's a great beginning point. Every single one of you out there, you can start by conforming your behavior to Christ. Now, let me give you a couple examples of how this has worked out in the past. There was a pastor named Richard Wurmbrand, and he was in, like, I think the 50s in Romania. And he was suffering under the communists because it was illegal for him to be preaching, and he was just being, he ended up in jail. So while he was in jail, the people who were interrogating him were beating him and torturing him and doing all sorts of things. And then he and his fellow Christian prisoners would turn around and go back to their cell, and they would pray for the people who had persecuted them and who had hurt them. Now that sounds like Jesus, right? Jesus came to die for his enemies. Jesus loved his enemies. Jesus sacrificed for his enemies. And actually, when some of the guards saw this, they actually became Christians. So there's an example of how your behavior, acting in the way Christ behaved, will show people who he is and actually can bring them to Christ. Now, another example that comes to mind for me is Christopher Hitchens. So Christopher Hitchens, now most of you know that he was a very famous atheist and he died a few years ago, but he used to do debates with an apologist named Larry Taunton. And Larry and his wife adopted a child who was HIV positive, and I think she might have been from Romania also. And Christopher Hitchens could not believe this. He could not believe that that they would do this, because his worldview doesn't have a basis for that kind of self-sacrifice and that kind of giving to others. So just by acting in this gracious and giving way, they opened up the door to, soon after this, Christopher Hitchens and Larry Taunton drove across the country, and they were reading John together as they went. So you just never know what these kinds of things will bring up. And then I can throw one last thing in there. Since it's St. Patrick's Day, I am a huge fan of St. Patrick. And if you guys don't know anything about him, I recommend you read his book. It's called, I think it's just called Confessions of St. Patrick. And his story was that he was kidnapped as a child and taken to Ireland, where he was a slave for, like, I think 6 years, and then he escaped. But then what does he do? He goes back, and he goes back as a missionary. So he goes back to the people who enslaved him. And so, I mean, that just blows my mind. But again, we see who Christ is in that, and it's a way to open up people to the gospel. And I don't want to take too much time on this question, but I do want to read one more thing. And this comes from Titus. And it talks about how let's see if I can find it here, how we can be a parable of God's grace to other people. So here's what it says. Remind them to be subject to rulers, to authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good deed, to malign no one, to be peaceable, gentle, showing every consideration for all men. And now he gives a reason. For we also once were foolish ourselves, disobedient, deceived, enslaved to various lusts and pleasures, spending our life in malice and envy, hateful, hating one another. But when the kindness of God our Savior and his love for mankind appeared, he saved us not on the basis of deeds which we have done in righteousness, but according to his mercy. So what happens there is we are supposed to treat people this way, to not malign them, to be kind to them when they're not kind to us, because that's what Christ did for us. So again, if we are doing that, we open up the door to them actually understanding the gospel. And then one last thing I want to
Yeah,
throw
this
out
is
there. And
great.
I could go on because I think Ephesians does this same thing. So
Mm.
I'll just throw that out there and say, look at what Paul does in Ephesians. But maybe that'll come back in a later question. But one last thing I want to say, because it's not just our good behavior that can demonstrate Christ. Even our openness about our sin, because I don't want you guys to be worried that I can't be good enough to do that. Well, guess what? You can't. So you're never going to be like Jesus exactly. But when you sin and you're open about it, you're also communicating something about the gospel. What you're communicating is that your trust is in Christ and his grace. So you don't have to hide it. Now, the people in the world, when they are guilty, they have to hide it because they have to make sure everybody doesn't know how bad they are. But we can be open about our sin because we know that it's covered. And I've heard many times people respond to that, like it really hits them when Christians are open about the idea that they are sinful, and they just show their humility and their trust in Christ in that way.
Yeah, that's absolutely excellent. Yeah, those I have to admit, the passages that talk about us suffering like Christ, as an apologetic are not my favorite, but they do certainly seem to be part of God's plan. So,
Well, and it
um,
can certainly help you look at suffering differently, right?
right,
When
exactly.
you know that and Paul talks about when you suffer according to the will of God as a Christian, it's actually God's will for us to go through these things. And you have like a long-term perspective on it and you
Mhm.
understand the purpose of it. It just makes it a lot easier n- uh, to not get angry and to endure, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I lived at I worked at, and as a part of my job, lived at a group home for troubled teenagers shortly after college. And we were taught in one of our courses there while I was there that the word for I think suffering or something like that is comprised of the Chinese characters for dangerous and opportunity or something like that. And I don't know if that's true, and it doesn't matter for the point of this comment, but we would go around. We were working, I was 21 years old, and I was working with 22, 23, 24-year-old young women, and we were in charge of taking care of troubled teenagers whose own parents couldn't take care of them because they were
Mm.
causing so much trouble. So what did we know, right? We were in way over our heads, but we were also being discipled as we were discipling the teenagers, and we would have uh, uh, just all kinds of strife and really suffering all the time. And so
Hmm.
we started kind of trying to make light of it by saying, whenever some sort of we felt some sort of suffering, we would yell to one another, opportunity, dangerous opportunity. And I came to know a lot more about that, as I was a brand new believer, actually. That was within a year of my becoming a Christian. And but I've come to know a lot more about how it genuinely is an opportunity to demonstrate Christ. People can't see his crucifixion because it happened 2000 plus years ago. So today,
Hmm.
people living today can't actually see it in person the way people saw it over
Hmm.
2000 years ago, but they can see the way we respond to our suffering, our hardships in a Christ-like way. And that really is an opportunity to display Christ to others. So I want to ask you, um, one of the main objections to Christianity from young people is the problem of evil. They
Hmm.
say, I hear this a lot. I mentor a lot of college students and young people, and they'll say um, that their friends will come to them and say, "I just can't believe in a good God because suffering exists, evil exists." And I was reading through your recent blog posts at str.org, and you talked about how, in a post on March 15th, just a couple days ago, about how Christians should expect suffering in this life and not be surprised when God doesn't make them completely happy and healthy and comfortable all the time. So What can Christians do to kind of take up more of an eternal perspective on their experiences in this life, and how might that be
Mhm.
helpful from the standpoint of apologetics?
Well, one thing, the first you mentioned that God, God doesn't his interest is not in us having a comfortable life.
Mhm.
This
Right.
is something I think it's really hard for in this society, and maybe that's changing a little bit because we have had some more troubles recently, as
Yeah.
we all know. Of course, by troubles, I mean I go to the store and I don't know if they're gonna have what I want, which actually we have it pretty good.
Mhm.
And so I think a lot of Christians in this culture in the West, we have this idea in the back of our mind that God's gonna make everything go the way that we want it to go.
Mhm.
And even if we have an intellectual understanding that that's not the case, I think most of us can say, "Oh, no, I don't really think that." But when you first go through suffering, what you will find is how much you really did think that secretly deep down without realizing it. And
Exactly.
that's when you really have to figure out, what does it mean to trust Christ? What am I trusting him for? What is the goal here? Um, so luckily we know what God's goal is for us. And, we all know Romans 8:28.
Mhm.
God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose. Okay, we all know that one. But the verse that follows actually defines what that means. And what it says is that God is conforming us to the likeness of Christ.
Mhm.
So our good is God conforming us to the likeness of Christ. And he does that very often through suffering. Again, just look at First Peter or numerous other books of the Bible. There's a lot about suffering in there. And what what you find is that the suffering refines us and it shapes us to be like Christ. Now, we know that Jesus promised that we would suffer, right? He
Mhm.
said, "The world will hate you if it hated me." Uh, all sorts of, there's all sorts of verses. I'm trying to think. Second Timothy about all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. We look at the prophets. We look at um, I Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the things that they went through. There was suffering. This is a pattern throughout. I mean, Jesus suffered. Who does God love more than Jesus? Jesus suffered. Suffering has a purpose. So it's not something we should be surprised at. And actually, that's what Peter says in First Peter also. Do not be surprised at the fiery ordeals among you, which
Right.
have come upon you for your testing. And by testing there, he means it's refining you and it's proving the reality of your faith and your trust in Christ. So it is definitely a normal thing. Now, you asked how do you get an eternal perspective on that? Well, I think the ultimate answer is you have to love God better than everything else, better than comfort and better than your stuff. I mean,
Mhm.
that's just the bottom line. If
Mhm.
you love something more than you love him, then you will walk away from him and you will turn towards the ease of your suffering or the keeping your belongings or whatever it is that you're in danger of losing. Now, so how do we do that? How do we increase our love for God? Well, I mean, the easiest answer is we need to read the Bible. We need to read it a lot. We need to read it over and over so that we can see who God is. Because as we see what he's done in history, that increases our love for him. And one thing that really helps me when I'm going through suffering, it's just a very simple thing to remember. You look at the cross, and what you see on the cross will help you get through suffering. The first thing you see is you see God's sovereignty and you see his wisdom. God brought everything in all of human history to that point at that time. He knew how to do that. He was able to do that. God is in control. So that's the first thing I think you need to know when you're suffering, that this is not out of control. There's actually a reason for it, and it's not outside God's control. That was God's answer to Job, actually.
Mhm.
When Job has his suffering, what does God say? All he does is say, hey, look, I'm sovereign and I'm in control. And I know all of these things that you don't know.
Yep.
So we see his sovereignty and we see his wisdom. And secondly, we see his love. Obviously, Jesus died for us, okay? The kind of love for his enemies that he shows there, Romans says, if Jesus died for us while we were God's enemies, how much more now that we are joined to God, and joined to Christ, and we're justified, how much more now he'll be there for us, right? So we see his love, and we also see God's power because God raised Jesus from the dead. So we know if God is sovereign, if God is loving, and God is powerful, that whatever's happening to us has a purpose. Remember, God's using it to make us like Christ. So it has a purpose. And because of that, we know that evil does not have ultimate power over us. Everything that's happening is happening for a purpose of making us like Christ. And we can rest in that, and we can rest in, have a long-term perspective. So I think that's one thing that I do that helps me to do that. And then you asked about how does this affect apologetics? Well, obviously the things that we love are the things that we share with people. We have shirts that advertise the things we like. We have stickers on our car. We have all these things. And that just naturally flows out of what we love. So the better we know God, the more we will love him and the more we will share him. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's really great. Yeah. Whether you're a Christian or not, you still have this reality of evil and suffering, and Christianity really actually explains it. It is the worldview that best explains the existence of evil and suffering. God created the world good. We are in rebellion against God, but we have a hope nonetheless. He has purposes in the midst of our suffering. And he has a great plan. He has proven himself time and time again through the crucifixion, like you mentioned, and the examples, the accounts that we read about throughout the Bible of the saints who have gone before us. That to see that God is working for their good. He's working for our good through our suffering. That's I like to also read about people like Mr.
Mhm.
Wurmbrand and some of the saints who have really been persecuted.
Like John Erickson Tata would be another good example.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I'm and to meditate on what is to come as well, on what God has promised us.
And you
So,
see how practical apologetics is here.
mhm,
This is about applying apologetics to real life. Well,
right.
let me tell you, suffering is real life.
Yep.
It is real
Exactly.
life. So when you can trust in the resurrection, when you can trust in God, and you can, because he's there, and you can remind yourself of all the reasons why he's there. All of these things help you make it through suffering.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you. This has been a really fun conversation for me, and we're going to go ahead and turn to the Q&A from the audience. So I have some questions here that people have put in the chat that I'm going to go ahead and ask you. So in a world where there is so much strife and division, especially through social media, how can we defend the faith and still do it with gentleness and grace, like First Peter teaches us?
Okay. So I think that the key to this, and some of the things we said before, I think we'll touch on this, but if you go back to Ephesians, here's what you see. The first 3 chapters of Ephesians, Paul is talking about all the things God did that show his love for us. Okay, so he talks about how it's all by grace, how we deserved, we were by nature children of God's wrath, all of these things. And then he comes to the end of this whole section, and he says, and let me just look it up really fast here because I want to read the exact thing here.
Yeah.
See if I
Please.
can find Ephesians. Oh, got right to it. Okay. So because of all the things that he's done for us, he says, "For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God." So here's what he said, okay? What he wants is for us to be filled to all the fullness of God by understanding his love, by grasping his love. And we know what his love is because he's just spent 3 chapters talking about what God's love looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing is, right after this, the first verse of chapter 4, he talks about, he says, "Now I want you to walk worthy of the walk in the manner of which you've been." I can't remember the exact words. "Walk worthy in a manner
And a man who worthy of the calling you have
worthy
received.
of the calling you've received." Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And so what he's saying is, and he goes on to say certain things like, be patient, be gracious, be humble, and they're all connected to the love of God. So because the love of God was gracious, we're to be gracious. Because of the love of God united the Jews and Gentiles, now we're supposed to be unifying. We're supposed to be humble because it was by grace. In other words, understanding the love of God as shown through the whole story of his redemption. If we can grasp that, what that will do is cause us to walk in a way worthy of that. It will change us. So how do we do this with gentleness and grace? We fill up to the fullness of God by understanding his love. And how do we do that? We do that by spending time looking at Jesus. And how do we do that? We read the Bible. And I could go on and on about how good it is for you to read the Bible over and over and over and let it soak into you. Read large portions at one time, preferably a whole book at one time for the smaller ones. And as you do this over and over, the gospel will change you. Jesus' character will change you. And that is how we are changed. We look at Christ, we pray. I don't want to forget that because obviously this requires a lot of supernatural help. So you pray, you read the Bible, you look at Christ, you let that change you, you fill up to the fullness of the love of God, and then you walk in a manner worthy of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's great. That's excellent. I have another question here. I have several Christian friends who have talked a lot lately about how difficult it is to be a Christian in the secular workplace, like in the case of Brendan Ike, who used to work for Mozilla. He made a donation to a pro-marriage organization and was forced out of his position as CEO of the company he founded. What advice would you give to someone who wants to stand up for the truth, but has to face dangers like potentially being fired, being ostracized, being condemned, things like this?
Mm-hmm. So some of the stuff we've already said, I think will apply to this. Keeping the eternal perspective, having our character changed, praying, reading the Bible, fellowship. I think those are the main things. You need support. It is really hard to continue to do what's right in the face of suffering.
Mhm.
Now, what's interesting, I talked a lot about First Peter earlier, and again, I think First Peter addresses this so well. And think about why. What is Peter known for?
For being
Peter
crucified.
denied Christ.
Oh, right. Yes, before that.
Peter denied Christ because he was afraid of the suffering.
Mhm.
So Peter spent a lot of time thinking about this topic. So what I would recommend, in addition to praying, reading the Bible, I recommend that you read First Peter every day for a month. Okay. And what I want you to do is look at all the reasons he gives for why you should continue to stand up for the truth, to do what's right, even when it causes you suffering. And I'm just going to tell you some of those. There's several of them, but I'm just going to go through a few of them. So one of the things he says is so that others will see your good behavior and they will be won to Christ. So that's one of them. We talked about that earlier about asking for the hope that's in you. And another one is so that others will see your behavior and then they will be put to shame. So it also serves for judgment. Okay. So it serves for God's grace. He uses it for his grace, but he also uses it for judgment. He also says we're called to imitate Christ and do what's right because we're called to do that, right? We're be holy, for I am holy, is what he says in there. So that's another reason to do what's right. He also says that we're to do what's right because God wants to bless us for doing what's right. He also says, do what's right. Don't give in to doing what's wrong because evil will be punished. And then I think, and there's the apologetic reason that we mentioned, so that they'll ask for, the account for the hope that's in you. And this is the one that Peter also says over and over. He spends a long time on this one, and I think this is a good one to meditate on. And it's the idea that we do what's right and we continue to do what's right because Jesus is victorious and we want to be on his side.
Mhm.
He wins.
Yeah.
Okay. You're going to suffer right now and it's going to look like they're winning. But guess what? God knows how to bring his people safely through and to bring about judgment on those who do evil.
Mhm.
And that's a huge point for Peter. So thinking about it, the whole last book of the Bible, Revelation, that's what it's about, right?
Right.
Jesus wins.
Mhm.
So again, we're back to that eternal perspective, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this life, even if we live the longest life among people today, that would be about 100 or so years. That is just a speck in light of eternity. So yeah, to keep our eyes on what is unseen, on eternity, on what is to come. Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask another question here from the chat. How do you introduce apologetics to women's Bible studies at churches that are content with feel-good devotionals and are very shallow in biblical content?
Okay, I can think of a couple different ones. What if you brought an unbelieving friend with you and just let her ask all the questions she wants?
That's great. I love it.
I guarantee you the next week, they're going to want to know some answers.
Mhm.
So that could be one way. I mean, I wouldn't do it without checking with your leader if you're not the leader. But if you are the leader, that's a great way. That's something that Brett Kunkel, he used to work here. He would do all the time. He would take kids out for these apologetics mission trips. But to start it off, he would bring in either a real atheist or he would role play an atheist. And he would ask them all sorts of questions and they'd realize they didn't know the answer.
Yep.
So a lot of times, and I think women especially, we engage in apologetics as we see a need.
Mhm.
So if you can help them to see that need in some way, that's really
Mhm.
helpful.
Mhm.
My second suggestion would be to read Greg's other book together. It's called The Story of Reality.
Mhm.
And the way it's written, it's not written like a normal apologetics book. It's such an easy read, and by easy I mean it flows really well. It's not a difficult to make sense of it,
Right.
and it goes through Christianity and it goes through theology, but it kind of weaves apologetics in there, so you don't feel like you're just reading apologetics. So that might be a way to transition to that kind of thing. I think it's a great resource, and there's and we have a video series on our website if you wanted to do that, or if you wanted everybody to get together and read it. But I think both of those might be a good direction.
Yeah, those are excellent.
You could even ask them, hey, everybody bring in an unbelieving friend. Let them ask all their questions, or you could collect questions. Maybe they could just ask their unbelieving friend to, give questions, and you could all collect all those questions and then say, okay, I'm going to give you guys a chance to answer these and see how they do. Once
Yeah,
they know their need,
yep,
it'll
that's
change
great.
things.
I was talking to a friend this morning about that very topic, that very idea, the concept of, showing people the practical need for it. And I was telling her that I mentor some of the kids in my neighborhood kind of informally. They like to go for walks with me, come over and throw the football around, things like that.
Aw.
And one of the little boys used to tell me, I don't need to know why Christianity is true, because I just already know that it's true. And he was 10 years old. So he was basically like, I don't care about anything you do. So, but, but then I would start asking him on our walks. So, so a friend of mine said the other day, that we can't trust the Bible because it was just made up by a bunch of men a long, long, long time ago, and it has nothing to do with anything today. How do you think I should answer my friend? And he'd be like, uh, uh, I don't I don't know. I don't know. What did you say? And so we'll just kind of start talking about it. Or, we had some
That's
Mormons
great.
coming around the neighborhood, and I'd ask him, "Oh, did the Mormons stop by your house?" And he's like, "Yeah, we just like closed the door and like didn't open it, and we just avoided them." And I said, "Oh, I actually had a really great conversation with them. One of the things they said was that the Bible's been corrupted, and changed, and so we needed a new prophet. And what do you think you might say to that?" And all sorts of things that I genuinely hear from other people. And
Mhm.
he's starting to realize, oh, I guess, I'm going to have to, I guess I should probably know how to answer some of these questions. So yeah,
Yep.
I think that's a really great way to handle it. Um, I think, and Greg's other book, The Story of Reality, is excellent. And you use the word theology, which it can scare some people. It's really not intimidating at all. You're right.
No,
It's a great resource,
it's
very
very
accessible.
readable. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think we may have time for one more question. I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway. um, what is a good, easier apologetic study to start in a women's group? I guess really The Story of Reality you've already
Yeah,
answered. So
we have but we also Zondervan created a video study of tactics and a video study of the story of reality. So either one of those would be a great place to start, I think.
yeah, okay, great. Well, yeah, thank you. This has been just absolutely wonderful. I always love talking to you. So I'll go ahead and close our time today for this episode of Voices of WIA. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Amy Hall, for joining us. Um, if you want to become better equipped for everyday conversations like the ones we've been talking about, check out our recommended reading list on our womeninapologetics.com website under the resources menu. It's called Recommended Reading List. It's very helpful, and it's got all the different resources broken down by topic. Next month on Voices of WIA will be our last episode of the season, and we'll be talking about how we can answer the most common questions all of us face about the scriptures. Are they reliable? Can we trust they were inspired? And many more. After this episode, we will be back in July with plenty more conversations with some of our favorite apologists. Make sure you are following on all our social media for future announcements. Have a great night.